Hello, you're listening to Future Artifacts FM, a radio show hosted by Niamh Schmidtke and Nina Davies.
Earlier this year, several radio frequencies were discovered airing a collection of broadcasts. At first, they sounded like regular news stories and interviews. They felt familiar, but also not quite belonging to our present. Slowly, the listeners came to believe that what they were listening to did indeed belong to their world, just not their time. They were looking into the future through the mundane edges of radio recordings and public service announcements. While this material is still being meticulously studied by researchers in various universities and museums, your hosts have managed to gain access to this collection to air a selection of these broadcasts for you, our listeners.
For full disclosure, we will not be sharing this collection with you, as this introduction is based on a fictional event. In this monthly broadcast, Future Artifacts FM, we will present speculative fiction pieces by artists and writers, followed by conversation with hosts Niamh Schmidtke and Nina Davies. The programme will focus on fictional works intended for broadcast, such as radio plays or fictional interviews, to carve out a better understanding of the now by exploring various interpretations of the future. Welcome back to episode 20 of Future Artifacts FM. Today is really exciting because we have co-host Nina Davies showing new work, and we have a wonderful guest presenter today, Rebecca Edwards. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
How are you this morning, Rebecca?
I'm good, thank you. Really happy to be here. This is my second time at Taco, which is where we are recording, and it's a really great area. This part of London is kind of undiscovered, I think, so it's nice to be somewhere new, and it's a really beautiful day. I'm good.
Maybe before, I think most of you listening in should know a bit about Nina's work. So before introducing Nina a bit, for those of you who don't know, I'll introduce Rebecca. Rebecca's a longtime friend of the radio show, but for a bit more context, Rebecca Edwards is a London-based curator, writer and producer. Her interests include cultivating experiential curatorial methods, interweaving fluid approaches to representation, dissemination and representation of artwork, and exploring the nested fields of technology, digital aesthetics and internet culture. Welcome
To the show.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm a long-time listener, first-time presenter, so I'm very happy to be here.
For this episode, I wanted to invite Rebecca because Rebecca just recently wrote an article about my work, so I thought it made sense to kind of have you come on for the next journey, basically the next chapter of my work. So we're really excited to have you on the show.
Yeah, I think it's also worthwhile saying that your expertise is in this field of kind of making and production and so forth. So yeah, it's really good to have your expertise and your background on this piece in particular, because I think Nina and I can talk about each other's work for like hours on end, but it might not always be the most intelligible version.
Oh, don't say that. I think it would be, but it's a different kind of conversation. I feel like this will be a well-rounded conversation.
So I'll give, for anyone who doesn't know Nina, which if you're listening to Future Artifacts, maybe listen back a few episodes. This is Nina's 4th episode on the show, which is really exciting because it's, as you said, the start of a new body of work. And for Nina, working primarily with video, performance, writing and installation, Nina Davies considers current dance phenomena in relation to the wider socio-technical environments from which they emerge. Previous research projects have included the recent commodification of the dancing body on digital platforms and rethinking dances of today as traditional dances of the future. Her work has been recently exhibited at Matt's Gallery in London, Transmediale in Berlin, 17 Gallery in London, Pradiato in Madrid and Chemist Gallery London. She's also part of the New Contemporaries exhibition currently on in Camden Arts Centre, closing
I think April something
20-something.
Yeah, I think when this episode airs, there'll be like 2 weeks left or something like that.
So before we get into the work, kind of saying this is part of a new body of research. It's kind of within the world that you've been fleshing out over the last year, 2 years. But this piece is called SUBSCANNERS.
Yes.
And it is a 15-minute fictional podcast, which for those of you who know Nina's work or have listened to previous episodes of her work, you'll probably kind of clue into some of the context of what's about to come next. But maybe before we start, is there anything you want listeners to know about the work going in, or themes to kind of hold in their heads? Or?
Yeah, I might just give a little brief synopsis of the work, because it touches on loads of different themes, and like most of my sort of fictional podcast works that I make, I think I'm borrowing your words, Neve, but you get dropped into the world. So and I guess for these worlds to make sense, or to be as realistic as possible, what is being talked about always exists within a very complex world. And when listeners are experiencing the work, I want them to not maybe focus too much on what's saying, or really trying to follow the narrative. I think let some things not wash over you, but I think there'll be fictional terms that I introduce that you might not know what they mean. So don't worry about thinking like, what does this mean? I need to look it up, because chances are it actually doesn't mean anything.
Or we'll go through it later on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we'll go through it later on. The main character, Peyton Sanders, who's being interviewed in the script, is being invited to talk about their work in the space sector on research about inter-repro. And my accent makes me drop the T. It's inter-repro, and the characters will also drop the T. And as the conversation goes on, they realize that the main character, Peyton, doesn't actually work in the space sector anymore. So the conversation kind of diverts through how their previous research in the space sector has kind of had some offshoots with labor scandals, and also the legal work that they have been brought on to kind of rectify some of these scandals, or continue to work on these labor scandals. And like all my works, it's kind of centered, the fiction kind of hangs on a dance, so that will play a part in the work. So I think that's kind of those are kind of the moments that we'll go through, is the kind of space sector work. Then we'll talk about the dance, and then some of the legal stuff at the end. So there's kind of, I would say that's sort of roughly the chapters in the work.
I think this piece in particular benefits from more than one listen. I mean, as Nina said, like, there are terms that, at least for Rebecca and myself, listening to the work for the first time, we were like, what does that mean? But yeah, maybe this moment of like suspending disbelief to get into the fiction, and then we'll bring back
open
the
up
belief.
some of those things. Yeah. Perfect. Cool.
All right. See you in 15.
Welcome back, listeners, to another episode of the DX, where you can tune in and get your weekly drip on, well, anything I find interesting. But no, if this is your first time here, welcome. No need to listen to any previous episodes. You can jump right on in here, as each episode invites in someone new that we think has an inside perspective on a range of topics. I'm your host, Drew Reed, and today we have a fascinating guest with us. You probably won't have heard of them, but they're a trailblazing researcher at Intrasat Park Center. They're working in the field of interreproduction. And if you don't know what that is, don't worry. That's what we're here to find out. Peyton Sanders, welcome to the show.
Hey, Drew. Thanks for inviting me and for such a flattering introduction. Although I wouldn't describe myself as a trailblazer exactly. And also, I probably should have told you earlier, but I'm not actually with Sat Park anymore.
Oh, when did that happen? Is that a relatively new thing, or?
No, it's been a while since I worked there, actually. Around 7 years now?
Oh, I'm so sorry. I don't know how I messed that up.
No, it's my bad. I should have mentioned it when you invited me to speak. I mean, my work is still adjacent to interrepro.
It's all good. So what are you up to? Sorry.
Are you okay?
Yeah, I'm all dried up. Can you just pass me one of those cans from the boxes behind you? This is so unprofessional. I should have drank something before we started.
What the hell is this? Nixatone?
They used to be one of our sponsors, but now that they're not, I've got no problem saying that this is probably the worst energy drink out there.
I haven't heard of it.
It's just not bubbly enough.
Can I try one?
Go for it if you dare.
Thanks.
Okay, let's start over. What was I asking you?
I don't remember.
Well, I guess I'll just get into it. I was wondering whether you could first tell us a little bit about the field of interreproduction. Because if I've got this right, you were part of the team from the beginning, right?
Well, yes and no. I mean, the theory of interreproduction has been around for 150 years, I think.
Okay.
And I guess to a certain extent, it's still in its theoretical stages, which are now coming to a close. But yeah, I was part of the first official inter-repro department.
Great. Now, Peyton, I've obviously invited you in to speak about inter-repro, and I do want to try and fit in what you're up to now. But for some of our listeners that won't be familiar with inter-repro, could you just explain what it is, please?
Oh yeah, of course. So interreproduction at its core is the study of reproduction between organisms and computational systems. So this could be anything from single cells to a living, walking human. Although we're far from reproducing a full human being, nor were we interested in that.
What do you mean?
Well, it's not something specifically on the roadmap. We weren't making medical research at Sat Park.
Right.
It's the space sector.
But, sorry, I was under the impression that human reproduction played a large part in research. That's right, no?
Of course, yeah, it did. But the whole reason why the inter-repro department was initiated was because we needed more natural resources back home. And at this point, we're unaware of the lengths we'll have to travel to find resources akin to those back home. So it's likely that we'll need to explore the universe over longer periods of time. And the probes we send out on these missions need hyperautonomy, which includes being able to reproduce itself as well as reproduce with anything it comes into contact with.
Right.
And our definition of reproduction is broad here.
Okay.
So when I say the reproduction between technical devices and organisms, I'm not necessarily talking about the physical convergence of a new form. Of course, that might be the end goal, but there's so much work to be done before we get there. We're basically talking about the reproduction of elements and organisms, right?
Sure.
Like minerals, which support technical devices, and organisms, which support biological life.
I see.
And really, the best place to start is, well, where work has already begun elsewhere. And in that case, it was in cognitive service automation.
Cognitive service automation? That's pretty vast. Were you looking at any specific faction of it?
Yeah, we were sort of working with a network made up of mini factions which learn how to become and think like an individual. But just to take it back a bit, we started working with cognitive service automation because basically it's a computational system that's already trained to process information like humans, or any life form for that matter.
Okay, I see.
And I could go into the technical details of how the different cognitive services operate in collaboration with each other, but I don't think you or your listeners need to hear me nerd out. So the way I usually describe this to people is that we were making new models from individual assisted models, and I can see from your face now that it's still confusing.
Yeah, a little.
Okay. It's basically combining an algorithm and a human. So the algorithm learns from or collaborates with an individual to produce a technical cognition, which is then something in between a person and an algorithm.
Isn't that just like cloning or making a cognitive avatar?
Well, that depends on how you want to look at it. I would argue that stance is verging towards being biocentric.
Oh, I'm not a biocentrist. I just wanted to clarify why it's not considered cloning.
Sure. Well, I think there's a general sentiment, at least among the people I work with currently, to not prioritize individuals over relationships, and to consider this technical cognition as something only belonging to its human counterparts would be to discredit the reproductive labor performed by cognitive technologies.
Okay, well maybe this is a good time to segue. So you left Sat Park.
Yeah.
Can I ask you what you're up to these days? And if I may, what made you leave Sat Park?
Certainly. So I have a background in computer science and digital anthropology, which led me to work in inter-repro in the first place. And I don't know if you remember much about the counterfeit labor scandal.
No.
Well, it was where corporations and state-run organizations were using auto-supervised offspring. The colloquial term is digital offspring, so I'll continue to call it that.
Are digital offspring the same thing as the technical cognitions you were just talking about?
Yeah, that's right. But yeah, so as I was saying, these corporations were using digital offspring as a sort of pseudo workforce.
Oh yeah, I remember this, of course. It was huge.
Yeah, I was actually poached by a legal research team that was working with Sat Park at the time.
Right, because Sat Park were involved in the scandal, right?
Yeah, specifically the inter-repro department.
And are you able to tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, how much time do we have though?
Enough time for sure.
I think I'll have to go fairly deep into it for it to make sense. Is that all right?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so moving on from what I was just talking about, In order for the algorithms to reproduce with humans, they of course needed data. So we fed it data sets, which we had from our sister tech companies, which included, well, all sorts of data: medical, social, security, which we obviously had access to. And after we fed the algorithms the data, we found a few commonalities in how the algorithms chose their, let's call them, reproduction partners.
Sorry, I'm surprised that you had to dip into data from sister companies. Why not select specific people to input their data for the experiment?
That's a great question. So one thing we needed to avoid was over-reproduction of our probes in space. You know, we can't just have them reproducing with everything they come into contact with. And so part of our research was tailored to creating a selection process for what materials or organisms our probes would choose to reproduce with.
Great. Sorry for the interruption. Go on.
No problem. So it turned out that the data point that our algorithms specifically clung onto was facial recognition setup data from our security companies. So this is like when you first scan your face to set it up as a key to unlock any of your technical devices.
Like unlocking the heart of the algorithm. That's so sweet.
Yeah, we thought it was pretty cute too.
Sorry, I have to interrupt this again, though. Have you heard of subscanning?
Of course, I'm a big fan.
It has something to do with this, right?
Absolutely it does.
I've wanted to get into this for a while now. Would you mind if we spoke a bit about this? I do want to come back to what you're doing now, though, but I think the people that do this are kind of nuts.
Really? I don't think so at all. But I've been knee-deep in a repro for so long that maybe I'm not the best person to judge.
For anyone listening that doesn't know what this is, subscanning is this dance that people do with their devices that's kind of like as if they're slow dancing with their devices. Have you ever done it, Peyton?
Yeah, I've attended a few events, yeah.
Where'd you go? Did you do it underground or on location?
I've done both. Sounds like you know a bit about it already, though.
I'm not going to lie, I'm low-key obsessed, but very outside of it. What brought you into it?
Well, I don't do it regularly, but the firm I was working with had some clients that went pretty frequently, and because these people weren't my clients directly, I decided to go see what it was all about, as it kind of contributed to my research.
I see. So what's it all about?
Okay, well, so some of the early inter-repro digital offsprings were co-opted by corporations for advertising, or by state-run operations like the military to be used for propaganda, which I guess is advertising as well. And the work I'm currently doing is around cases where people are basically fighting for the rights over their digital offspring. And maybe we'll get back to that later, but the dominant narrative in the press was focused on the technologies that allowed for something like this to happen. But the thing is that it's not really the technology that's at fault here, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's the corporations that are profiting from their counterfeit labor. And so some people kind of figured this out, and they also figured out that, if anything, the technology was in the same situation as the victims.
So the technology is also a victim here?
Exactly. And this group of people, who eventually became SUBSCANNERS, realized that they now exist within a complex network of kin, whether it be with digital partners, lovers, offspring, and maybe eventually one day ancestors. They decided that they needed to retain the languages and protocols that enabled discourse and connection in the first place. And so I guess it makes sense that these courtship rituals like subscanning emerged, reigniting that first connection in an effort to create some form of relationship.
Do you think that these relationships are real? Like, are they communicating back to each other?
It depends on how you define communication. I'm not sure exactly how the communication is functioning, but I do think that these dances are a way of trying to access offspring or parent models because, don't forget, corporations monitor and control the activity of these offspring and parent algorithms.
Right, I see.
So it makes it near impossible to access communication, and in some circumstances, even illegal to access communication.
That's crazy. I didn't know that. Also, do you know why subscanning started in underground transport networks?
No particular reason, really. I think it just became a place to hang out. No one was, or people weren't traveling to work anymore. I mean, surely you've gone down there for no reason in the past few years.
Yeah, I'll admit. I've found myself down there to read a book on occasion.
Don't we all? But yeah, I mean, it did become the primary place for these kind of rituals, and I think it was purely for this reason.
And location subscanning, was that performed by the same people? How did that come about?
Yeah, location subscanning is slightly different, and I know less about it. But it came from this idea that these networks are connected to places. So Specific locations were set up where people could gather and collectively try and communicate with their partners.
What do you mean by networks are connected to places?
Yeah. So, do you remember when autonomous vehicles that were manufactured in Unborn were sent to the unknown northern lands?
No.
Well, after they were distributed, it turned out that the vehicles didn't work because roadside animals in that territory jump rather than run and walk.
Oh.
And this threw off the vehicle's plane registration, which would cause them to malfunction. So it became clear that cognitive services actually had a home, culturally, environmentally, and spiritually. And I guess this discovery led some scanners to believe that there might be some kind of home they might return to, which is why locations were erected for the dancing to take place.
Peyton, we're running out of time, but there's enough time for one more question, I think.
Go for it.
I'd like to go back to what you're up to now, if you're all right with that.
Where did we get to?
I don't think we got that far. I think you were talking about the inner repro research, the sort of selection process of like these algorithms finding a mate.
That's great. Well, I'm going to skip over that because we don't have the time to get into the details. But I guess, so I was brought in to do research for a law firm that were representing the human victims of the counterfeit labor scandal. And to be honest, for a while I was a little lost.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It's surprisingly rare to find legal modules and computer science courses, if you can believe it. So I had a lot of catch up to do. And actually, it's funny that we've been talking about subscanning because a lot of the thinking from these communities inspired some of the directions I took.
No way.
Yeah. So based on this thinking around digital offspring as kin, I wondered if they were granted legal personhood, would they then have their own rights?
Oh, that's genius.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, I looked into it, obviously, and I couldn't believe it, but they already were considered legal persons.
Oh, what?
Yeah, crazy, huh?
Yeah, but surely this is a good thing, right?
Yeah, it should be, but this is where things get totally crazy. So, because the parent parties are considered legally absent, the corporations that monitor their communication are considered legal guardians.
What? But is that even how legal personhood works?
No. Basically, what's happened here is somehow corporate entities have managed to expand their access across different forms of law, which suits their needs.
What do you mean by different forms of law?
I mean private, public, and criminal law. They used to solely operate under private.
Right, I see. So where are you now with this? It sounds like a pretty colossal job.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, bringing public law into cyberspace is no easy task. But one sort of quick fix we've managed to apply to these cases, the ones we were specifically working on, was actually taking corporations to family court to fight for custody over the digital offspring.
So you played them at their own game.
To be honest, that was the only thing we could do, but it wasn't easy. Yeah, I know we're running out of time, right?
Yeah, this is really interesting, and I hate to cut you off. Do you have any closing remarks to leave us with about this legal dilemma we found ourselves in?
I guess we need more computer scientists working in legal research, to be honest.
Well, there it is. If there are any aspiring computer scientists out there, you found your calling. Peyton, a big thank you for coming in today. It's been fascinating and eye-opening.
No, thank you, Drew.
Now, just because we didn't go super deep into inner repro, would you mind suggesting any further sources for anyone who might have tuned in thinking this is what they'd be listening to?
Certainly. So, Space Place, which is a great podcast in case anyone is specifically interested in space. And I've been a guest on a few shows, including Interdexter and NCT Skelpit. So you can hear me talk there if you're not sick of me already.
I doubt that would ever be the case. Thanks so much again, and see y'all in 2 weeks.
Bye.
Bye now.
Cool. Welcome back, everyone. Hope you enjoyed SUBSCANNERS. And now to start off the questions, I'm going to pass it over to Rebecca.
Thank you for that, Nina. So subscanning is the fourth dance in this body of work you've been making over the last year or so. Could you tell us how you got to this dance and what the other dancers were looking into broadly? Kind of what was the trajectory of this?
The overarching project is rethinking dances seen today on like platforms like TikTok or just any sort of emerging, I say dance trends, but sometimes these things aren't necessarily classified as dances. They're sort of movement-based, like body movement-based practices. And I rethink them as if they are traditional dances of the future. And there's a book that I got out from Treadwell's, which is like a witchcraft bookstore near the British Museum. And it was about European folk dance, and they described traditional dance to sit within sort of 4 pillars or 4 categories, which are expansive as well, but it's usually dances of war, agricultural dances, spiritual dances, and fertility dances. And so this sort of body of work of making these fictional dances, I've kind of created 4 to kind of sort of loosely fit into these categories, but I kind of also rethink these categories as well. A lot of traditional dances will relate in some way to labor and technology used at the time. And so in that sense, I'm rethinking like what a spiritual dance is, or what an agricultural dance is in relationship to the technology that we use today. And so this final one, SUBSCANNERS, is based on the tube girl trend, which is a dancer who, or not a dancer, I guess just an influencer who makes work in the London Underground and uses her phone on 0.5, the front camera on 0.5, and kind of adopts music video aesthetics with like sort of the wind machine or the wind from the tube, sometimes also leaf blowers. And the trend has kind of caught on and has been performed by people in underground or subway or metros worldwide. And yeah, so I've taken that dance and abstracted it and turned it into this story. And I am looking at this dance as if it were a courtship ritual. And so in the script, there's sort of 2 different types of subscanning. So we have the underground one, which is very much sort of in relation to Tube Girl. And then we also have the on-location subscanning. And I guess when I was doing some research about different kinds of courtship dances or rituals, they usually fall into 2 sorts of categories. So it's usually dexterity performances, where one person, I guess it's sort of like peacocking, where one person is showing off their physical skills to another person to attract a partner. And then the other kind of courtship ritual are partnering patterns. So that could be like a ceilidh or a barn dance, or where you have these sort of intricate floor patterns of people weaving in and out and dancing with a variety of partners in one song or one set. And the reason why these sort of partnering pattern dances exist is because when labor was split between men and women women weren't going to schools either, there was no way for men and women to meet, so this would be how they would meet. So it's sort of like a speed dating, like an ancient speed dating ritual.
Well, I'm thinking of like when you see certain period dramas and you see the scenes where they all come into the ball and they're like twirling around each other, and then shock horror, they meet the one man they don't like, but it's like that motion of like the crisscross of people weaving in and out, and then you'll touch hands with at least like 4 other people to like say hello to, or to gossip with, or to In this work, I sort of wanted to rethink, I guess, the function of like the sort of, I guess, really take the sort of sex out of it, or take that sort of more biological idea out of it, and really think about how these two sort of rituals function. The character Peyton, working in the space sector, they kind of come across this dance or these ideas of dances, and they're like, oh, this could be a really great way of looking at how algorithms pick out people, or could we like put these sort of ritualized logics into a system of like how some form of digital reproduction might operate, and is there something in these rituals that are maybe not so human that can be borrowed.
Just to go back to the idea of a dexterity dance or a peacocking, I remember when we spoke before, you were saying that subscanning was kind of like a slow dance, or it maybe even says it in the work that it's a slow dance with the devices. And I'm thinking back to Tube Girl and how you got us to do it at the photographer's gallery at the event. For screen walks, and it felt very strange. It felt very intimate for me to be like holding up my phone and recording myself. And I'm just wondering, like, in terms of Tube Girl and in terms of all of these other influencers that are maybe treating it like a slow dance with their device, who are they peacocking for? Or what does subscanning? Is subscanning a kind of peacocking for the technology itself?
Yeah, and I think, yes, that's a good question, because I think I would say that not just this dance, the subscanning. I think that sort of some of my previous sort of like fictionalized traditional dances also look at this sort of same thing of this sort of performing for an algorithm. And I think on TikTok, unlike Instagram, you're not posting for your followers, you're kind of posting for the For You page. You don't really have a specific person in mind when you're posting. And so actually what you're performing for are the views and the likes. I mean, of course, we're doing that on Instagram as well, but I think Instagram, you kind of know who your audience is. Whereas on this, it's not really about anyone. It's kind of just about that number and just about getting onto the For You page. And the Tube Girl thing, I think, is like, it kind of takes it to the next level, I think, because Bionic Step, which is my first one, I remember seeing people dance in like Trafalgar Square with their ring light and doing this thing. And there's so many people in Trafalgar Square, and and there's also buskers who are performing for the people in Trafalgar Square, but then there's these TikTok dancers who aren't performing for anyone. But then I think then you take that kind of tradition or way of performing, and then you take it onto the tube in a really busy, condensed space.
I'm just thinking my favorite thing of the Tube Girl videos is like seeing all the people's disgust in the background.
But it's such a violation of people's personal space, and I think that's what I really love about it. It's like this kind of soft activism of like, I don't care about your social etiquette rules. Like
there was one post where she's filming herself at the end of the tube carriage, and she's kind of jumping, and she's sort of saying like, look who I bumped into, and she turns the phone around to face the window into the next carriage along, and there's these like 4 young schoolboys like jumping, and it turns out there's some other crew that make video on the tube. I haven't come across who they are, but it was this moment of like, I don't know, just really thinking about what's happening underground as like, maybe not a subculture, there's like a multiplicity of these kind of subcultures that are existing.
I'm kind of interested in getting a bit more into this point about the use of a younger generation finding a creative space in a literal underground network, because I'm thinking about barriers to entry for that. You need an Oyster card or you need a credit card to go down there. Is there some sort of enforced safety? Do they feel more safe down there to create content? What is it about being underground, like being on a moving vehicle? Because it also reminds me a little bit about when you're on a plane and you can buy tax duty-free stuff.
Right.
Because it's that kind of weird no man's land. Is that also within that logic for them, or?
Yeah, I don't know whether I could answer that because I'm not young anymore. Yeah, well, actually, maybe one thing to say is that there is actually something really interesting about how the underground or any subway or metro network is that it's a place to get to work. And with the younger generation, a lot of them will be content creators. Like influencers are the new salesmen or salespeople. And so this space is actually a place of work. And in my story, I've made them social spaces. But actually, maybe if you're making content down there, it's become the location of work rather than a social space. But I think there's something really interesting in that anyways, where like right now, where what is considered social is also considered work.
I might go back to the work a bit more, because there's kind of, as you hinted at beforehand, there's quite a few like chapters, sections, themes in the work. And one of the things that for me was really interesting was thinking about the legality. So part of the conversation in SUBSCANNERS is discussing legal frameworks and those which protect and contain these new digital offspring. So both kind of thinking about, let's say, corporate abuses on the offspring, but also, what is actually like a framework for protecting them. And I guess what parts of law, maybe you can give us a little bit of a description of what digital offspring are, or maybe where they're coming from, and then what parts of the legal system or of law in general were you researching when you were kind of constructing this, because it feels kind of close to our present, but it's not quite there.
Yeah, so the digital offspring, they are kind of somewhere in between a human and an algorithm. And I guess maybe some people could argue that that's sort of what AI is. It's like using human modes of thinking to create an artificial way of thinking. Although the way I've sort of imagined this in this work is that it's not simulating like a generic sort of human way of thinking. It's like linked to a very specific person. So it is very much half one of one thing and half of the other. And I guess IP and image rights have always been something that has really interested me. And I guess right now some of the actor strikes in the States about the reuse of people's images being used in films is kind of a little bit like that. Or what was it? There was a woman who was a model who was on, funnily enough, the train on the underground or subway or something, and she saw an ad and the body looked exactly like hers. She was like, that is a pose that I've done. And it turned out that whoever, I guess, took that image, or I don't know whether it was the modeling agency or whether it was the company that did that specific job, had sold that image onto someone else to use. And I think there's this sort of course, we're seeing that right now with like image rights and people's likeliness being reused and reproduced. And I guess part of me was thinking of like, what's the next step of that? Could the way that you think be, I mean, I guess maybe we could say that surveillance capitalism is sort of doing that already, kind of taking the way that we think and selling that data onto someone. And I guess it was sort of that thinking about sort of what that end product is and who does it belong to. So you were going to say something, Rebecca?
Well, I'm just thinking, you were mentioning like people's likeness being used elsewhere, but you've also got kind of the deep fakes like Swaggy Pope and songs as well, like people making songs out of Kanye West's voice or whatever, singing, rapping, whatever. I also want to bring up this idea of WorldCoin, because I feel like it's like a real world kind of outcome of some of the things that you're talking about. So WorldCoin is essentially a kind of digital passport that's based on biometric data, and it's intended to prove that the user behind an online account is a real person.
Right.
But the way that they've gone about kind of initiating this idea of a WorldCoin is pretty dodgy. They were giving monetary sort of bribes essentially for people in sub-Saharan Africa and places like this to kind of register themselves as part of WorldCoin to get it started. It's really dodgy. It's a scan of your iris, and that's what they're using. So it's not a fingerprint, it's not a blood sample, it's your iris. Right. And there's just something really dark about that for me to think about, that this is actually happening, as well as many other things that are happening to do with biometric data. But yeah, how that then also feeds in, like who owns that data then? Yeah. And what are they going to do with it?
That's interesting. Also coming back to this thing with sub-scanning, is that I was thinking about what this kind of movement is, which is taking your phone and basically like, it's the act of sort of scanning your face, and it's that sort of collection of that data which is used to then unlock your devices, and you have to set in that key, I guess. And thinking about, well, I guess I say it in the work, that being that sort of first moment that you sort of connect with some sort of algorithm or technical device where it recognizes you.
The kind of key point in that, which also goes back to what you were saying about WorldCoin, is, Apple is, if you're doing it with like, let's say an Apple phone or any kind of smartphone like a Samsung or whatever, they're companies, they're not, let's say, state actors, for example.
Yeah.
So then there's this question of, obviously now you have kind of, let's say, supranationals like the EU, which are trying to start protecting these forms of, let's say, our data more concretely, but also there's still that question of like, what happens with that, like with that version of my face? What happens if that gets sold to some kind of surveillance company, and then if they're looking for people, then they have this like 360 capture of my face?
Yeah.
But you mentioned there that sort of these big companies kind of, they're not actors within, I can't remember exactly what you said, but they hold a lot of power. And I think that's really scary. And I think that's what people forget as well, that nothing is free. Like I recently downloaded a new weather app for free, which was really silly because they have, I'm blindly just accepting their terms and conditions. And now I realize that they are tracking my movements. They know my location. They know all these sorts of things about me. And there are many apps out there that are free that can take all of this data and essentially do what they want with it. They can sell it. They can give it to nefarious people in big tech. They can give it to the government. And I think we're not, as a whole, we're just not educated in these kinds of systems. Everything's happened so quickly that we're all kind of in this blind, well, most of us are just in this blind acceptance of technological's positives, and we're not questioning its negatives or the ways that it can actually harm us.
Yeah. There's sort of the sale of that data and it kind of being sort of used to, let's say, like target ads or whatever. But I think the sort of leap, the speculative leap that I'm making in the work is also sort of thinking about what happens when this data that's collected starts to act not on its own, but it actually kind of doesn't have any relationship to you anymore. It's not used to sell you something. It is used to act on its own. So I guess that's where I introduced this term counterfeit labor, where it's labor being performed, but it's not your labor anymore. It's a labor of something else that kind of is linked to you, but you have no way of saying like, yes, I endorse this. Thinking about, I guess, in terms of how I think about these sort of dances, I guess, relate to technology and labor. I was kind of thinking about how labor is shifting for us. And might continue to shift, is like where labor isn't actually connected to us anymore, and what does that mean? But I'm aware that maybe I haven't really answered the legal question. We always do like a pre-show chat, and obviously I was kind of telling you some of the research that has kind of gone into this, and I came across a writer maybe like last year called, I'm going to probably pronounce her name wrong. It's like Muriel Hildebrandt, and she's a Dutch legal writer and philosopher. She's written 2 really great books called Law for Computer Scientists and Other Folk. That's her most recent book. And then Smart Technologies and the Ends of Law. And she's been working in sort of looking at how law is moving into or not moving into cyberspace. And in her book, her most recent book, she explains like how the law functions and the history of the different eras of law. So there's sort of different eras, and she describes them as speak space. So when law is the sort of code between people. So this is before language. The next era of law is manuscript space. So when the king kind of creates the law and there are scribes who write down the codes. The next era is book space. And she talks about how every era borrows something from the previous era. So one of the foundational manuscripts of book law is the Barbarian's Code, which I'm quite keen to read because it'd be really interesting to see like actually how it links to today. And so book law is kind of where we still are now. And book law is very abstract. So it's that sort of like section this, go to section here for this thing. And there's a sort of hierarchical system in book law. And she's saying that we should be in cyberspace now, like legally, but there's not enough computer scientists working in law. But where computer scientists are working in legal fields is in corporate law. And so corporate law is, I don't know if this is her quote or whether this is someone else's quote, but it's a really great quote saying, corporations eat law rather than obey the law and work within the law. So they're just kind of, they are deciding how law functions in cyberspace. And basically, corporations which usually function within private law, they can kind of change things in public law and start to operate however they want across multiple disciplines. After reading that, I guess I wanted to kind of respond to that a bit in this work with just sort of imagining what that could look like in terms of corporations, in this case, starting to use family law for their own means, and how people might start to, how we kind of need to basically, if corporations are eating public law, are we at a point where we're too late to be moving into cyberspace? Or do we need to be kind of meeting the corporations in how they're working? One of the reasons also why I'm really interested in sort of thinking about different eras of law and what that means is, I guess we were talking about law as sort of world building practice. And I feel like we're sort of at a moment of being like, if the law starts to move into cyberspace, what is that world going to be? Right now, we're kind of experiencing this world building beginning to take place. It's like there is a world that was built and now people are like, whoa, this isn't working. And I feel like now that's kind of we're at a point where we're seeing, I guess, these new codes start to come together, or not come together, but we're starting to become aware of them.
Yeah.
So we've kind of said that this work questions ideas surrounding personhood or a new kind of digital personhood. But if we think about legal personhood being the right to own property, etc., it's all defined by these regulatory bodies who can just as easily lock you out as a system as let you in. And you mentioned something before about decentralized systems, and I think in blockchain technologies specifically, or like these digital nation states like cryptocurrency, we see this negation of relying on governmental forces for validation in exchange for a system that is decentralized. And these systems are also kind of experimenting with this new idea of digital personhood in ways that supplant the idea of personhood that we have now. But with the digital offspring that we hear about in the work, how do you see them identifying in this new system that we might be transitioning into? And maybe does it in some way echo this idea of making kin with the machine, or this idea of inter-reproduction that you mentioned before?
Yeah, so Niamh had recommended me this article called Making Kin with the Machine. And when I told Niamh that I was making a sort of courtship ritual dance, I think you recommended me this article ages ago and I never got around to reading it. And then I think the first thing you said, you're like, oh, well, you have to read. You were like, well, you have to read Making Kin with the Machine now. And I was like, okay, fine.
Yeah, I think we talked about this on an episode like last year while I was on residence, and I was like, it's brilliant. And then,
and it is brilliant. I highly recommend reading it. It's written by a few different authors. And to kind of just loosely preface the article, it's a collection of short, I don't even want to say essays, because they're shorter than essays, aren't they? They're like
it's multiple sections, each exploring different Indigenous groups' relationships with language, relationships, and also with technology, mainly from America, so like North America and the Pacific Islands.
Yeah, and I guess the one thing that they preface at the beginning is the views that are being written about belong to the individual people, because it's about, do we consider machine kin? And those are conversations that are sort of maybe happening amongst these writers and their peers, but everyone has a different view on it. So these are sort of like very specific points of views on what making kin with machine would look like. And there's one particular writer who is talking about, so if we are to consider AI as kin, what is that AI? Are you making kin with a sort of corporate AI, a corporate made AI, or are you making kin with an AI that you have made or that your community has made? It's sort of like, who do you accept into your kin? So it's not about it just sort of being like, yeah, everything that is some form of artificial intelligence will be considered kin. And when I read that, I was thinking about, I guess that's where the idea of digital offspring sort of came about. That it's not just generally the technology that is kin, but it's these sort of very personalized versions of this technology. And again, I mean, all of it's sort of a speculative leap. I'm not saying that this is actually something that is happening.
Also talking about digital personhood, but that coming in a legal sense from legal personhood, which is something that has been used for a long time by different corporations in order to protect themselves in legal battles, but also more recently is being used by different governments and, let's say, ecological or environmental agencies to give protections to rivers, to sacred spaces of land, and so forth. And I guess for me, thinking back to Making Kin with the Machine, there's this idea of relationships and that seeming human, but also in terms of I mean, there's this one section, brilliant section, which is by a man from the Lakota people, and he talks about this making kin or making relationships is also like, what is my relation to an AI then? Is it an ancestor? And also considering within that, and for Lakota people thinking about their entire environment and being kin, not with other humans, but also with kind of the creatures and the other beings that they share that space with. So thinking about kin also as this series of relationships. And I guess when I think about that in terms of digital personhood and let's say legal personhood, is then what protections do we have within that? And kin, not just as something of care, because I think that's one side of it, but of the relationship. And part of that in the piece is like the relationship of being like a guardian. You know, this is your offspring, this is your kind of child, but not really. And then I guess part of the question posed to me by the work is, if we live in a system right now where legal personhood is something that's quite difficult to genuinely protect, like I think Ecuador has made legal personhood for many of its rivers because of the scale of corporations wanting to mine and harvest, you know, whatever in the country. What hope do we have for digital personhood?
I guess that's sort of like the twist in the script where it's like they find out, they're like, oh, what if it had legal personhood? Then it would be protected. And I guess going back to that last thing, they're like, well, it was given like legal personhood, but then because it's given legal personhood, there was like all these other kind of family laws that these corporations are kind of like using and manipulating to use for themselves. I use the legal personhood as an example because I think that sort of there's a history with that sort of battle between like the corporate personhood and the natural personhood, or like expanding what legal personhood is. And I feel like with this work, there's sort of like an expanding of what legal personhood actually even means for us, in between that sort of digital and physical personhood.
Yeah, well, I guess there's something weird in law when a corporation becomes a legal person, but it's the idea, you know. So it's not digital, but it's not physical. And so I guess thinking about, I guess coming back to what you were saying earlier about cyber law and kind of this catch-up game we're playing to get there with, let's say, major corporations.
It's also thinking about what if like part of you is now considered a legal person. So what's your relationship to that that digital version of yourself if it's now suddenly given its own personhood. So are you then like so then do you need to apply family law to that? I mean, of course, as I said, this is all fictional, but like, then do you become a legal parent or guardian of that version of yourself? And actually, who is the other parent of that? Because it's not just you, it's also the technology that's allowed for that sort of split to happen. So, and then I guess I go like one step further in the script of them being like, and then so that technology, who does that technology belong to? Is that technology purely a company, or is it something that's also performing labor for a company? I feel like I sound like a crazy person when I say this.
I'm just imagining, like, I don't know, a deep fake of like a Taylor Swift child and her trying to claim like family law to like reclaim that deep fake child as like a very like, let's say, direct application of some of the ideas you're talking about in the script.
But there is also existing already this idea of a digital twin. Right. But it's more to do with, I think, products or software or these kinds of things. But then I'm thinking about, social media platforms and how these are also kind of our digital twins. Yes, we author them. It's not like it's taking our data and putting a likeness of us out there, but they are essentially ourselves in digitized format. And I'm thinking about when you pass away or when you die, you have to go through this very kind of weird legal system on Facebook to delete your account or to transfer ownership of your account.
Well, there's also an app now that you can, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt, but there's also an app now that you can curate how you are perceived in death through all of your data. So there's basically a way of being like this text. So you like authorize like a snippet of a text message. I mean, like that's like how I think I am, and that's like how I want to be remembered. So you can like curate a version of you post death, basically. Wow. So yeah, it's a service if anyone's interested. I'm just sponsored this episode now.
Yeah, I'm just imagining now like these AI ghosts kind of speaking the voices of our text and WhatsApp messages when we pass away, like almost inhabiting this cyberspace, but like as these ghost-like versions that now that they're not repopulated with us, let's say, anymore.
Yeah, like, but I guess, and that's like, I guess maybe like then going back to this idea of like offspring, like there is kind of that. I guess I guess you create a version of yourself to biological offspring would be like you create a version of yourself in someone else to exist and carry on some sort of thing. And I guess I wonder what that digital version of yourself, like, is there something about sort of like legacy or wanting to exist, and especially with that app, like wanting to exist in a specific way?
I want to quickly go back to this idea of like what you were saying about conception and digital, like the offspring and kind of the birthing of an offspring, because this kind of language is often used within like generative adversarial networks within AI. For example, Joel Simon's project GAN Breeder, so literally breeding two images together to form another image in a generative way. I just kind of felt like that personification of technologies, you see it so many times in so many different ways, but yeah, this idea that things do breed within AI, especially within generative AI.
Cybernetics is also like totally based on like a biological, it's like sort of very much comes back to the natural world, and so much of the digital is actually inspired and based off of the natural world. So there is kind of like a cyclical loop, which is why I sort of said at the beginning, I was like, I'm not sort of imposing this like crazy new idea like, whoa, offspring, did you know like the natural world can exist as well? I guess it's more about our shifting relationship to ourselves with our labor and with ourselves is, I guess, going back to this idea of like courtship, going back to the tube girl, this dancing with yourself, performing this version of yourself for no one but yourself or for this like algorithm. It's not really, I guess these dances are like a sort of embodied like version of this, where you kind of see it happening in practice. It's like taking this process and not just looking at it happening behind a screen or in a sort of digital sphere. It's like actually watching how it's changing the way that we act as bodies.
I think that might be a great place to close. Nina, you've mentioned before that this is becoming part of a moving image work. Can you talk about what you have coming up next?
So this will be the sort of like basis of my upcoming show, which I think will be called SUBSCANNERS. Go figure. Which will be opening in May at the end of May at 17 Gallery, which is in East London. And I guess we'll be on for like, I don't know why I'm looking at Rebecca. I'm like, Rebecca, tell me how long we'll be on for. Like 6 weeks or something like that. And there'll be some live performances. Not every day, but there will be some live performances at the opening. And videos and a whole bunch of stuff. You can come and just become your own sub-scanner. Just like immerse yourself. Basically, the gallery will be a place to immerse yourself in sub-scanning culture.
That sounds great. Thanks, Nina. Thank you, Rebecca, for being our guest presenter on this episode.
Thank you for having me. It's been really fun.
It was really great. That's all from us for now. Thank you for tuning in for episode 20.
And for episode 21, we'll be coming back to talk about Neve's new work, which will be really exciting. We're doing that, right?
Yeah. Probably be talking about making kin with the machine again. So
tune in for part 2.
Yeah, for any listeners who really want their hands on that text, send us a DM on Instagram and we'll try get it to you.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Bye.
Bye.